So between Games Workshop and the leakers, we now have the vast majority of Codex World Eaters unveiled to us. Let's talk about the rules from the new book as we have them so far. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking World Eaters once more. It's the next Codex to be coming out for Warhammer 40k, and perhaps compared with just about any of the other books besides the ones that actually leaked in full, it seems that we know the vast majority of the contents. What isn't in this book. I've covered all these leaks in a whole bunch of videos before, but today I thought we'd put it together with pretty much a comprehensive overview of the Codex. Between the leaked info and Games Workshop's information that largely backs things up, it seems that we've got a fairly good handle on what's coming. For this video we're going to be going through Codex World Eaters section by section, a review based on compiled leaks playtest rules. Broadly these leaks come from the World Eaters Discord server, but there's been a few other things like points pages, plus a few individual leaks datasheets. So far just about everything that Games Workshop has previewed has pretty much been the exact same as the leaks that we've got. It means that they're very trustworthy in my mind, and even if there are a few small differences between this set of leaks and what comes out in print, I feel like the differences are going to be small and not all that meaningful. In this video we'll go through each section and what we know so far, and as we go along I'll talk about which bits are leaks and which bits are actually confirmed by Games Workshop. In particular their battle report preview has shown us a whole ton of stuff that is true. I treat this as a bit of a preview of the Codex, and of course when the book does come out I'll be doing a full Codex review. Let's jump in though, and starting with the Codex contents, and this overview is broadly based on the leaks rules, though so far Games Workshop hasn't given us anything to doubt this. It seems that Codex World Eaters is going to be taking a bit of a break from the rest of the codexes of 9th edition, and Games Workshop is going for very different things compared with things like Death Guard or Thousand Suns for example. Overall the general theme of the Codex is that as per these rules, Games Workshop's probably going for a slightly slimmed down rule set, maybe to address criticisms of rules bloat in 9th. In the book, the World Eaters will become their own proper faction, and no longer will basically be a supplement sort of legion to Codex Chaos Space Marines. It does have some positives, but it also means that many options will be lost, like say Thousand Suns or Death Guard. They won't be having any rules for things like Raptors or Havocs, I'm afraid. They're basically functioning as their own independent army. They get their improved Legion trait. Rather than those wanton rules, they'll have a Blood Tithe, which is their pure army special rule, basically killing things to unlock some better combat abilities for the army. Supposedly the Stratagem section is greatly reduced compared with other codexes, only 8 of them, and in Games Workshop's battle report they didn't show off any that weren't leaks. Only 3 Warlord Traits and 3 Relics, plus no other options to get more, though each of the 3 unique characters within the book have their own unique Warlord trait if you happen to have them as the Warlord. Then, interestingly, the Codex seems to almost be split in two, depending on whether or not you feel them as core World Eaters or through the Army of Renown, the Disciples of the Red Angel. This feels like quite an in-depth, Angron-led Demonkin style army, and interestingly it looks like you swap out the stratagems for different ones, you mix demons in with the army, and you get a few other relic options and a buff to 8-bound. Maybe this might be a flavour of army that Games Workshop has going forward, multiple different ways to play an army, but rules that actually replace other ones elsewhere in the book rather than add to them, so you only have a set number of stratagems to remember, rather than say having 30 plus a bunch more from Armies of Renown. For the datasheets from that leaked points page, we have a bunch of World Eater specific ones. The new kits will be Angron, Lord Invocatus with a twin kit with the Juggernaut Lord. We've already got the existing model for Khorne the Betrayer, and then Khorne Berzerkers will be getting new models, those new Jakhals cultists, and the 8-bound and the Exalted Eightbound, again both built from the same kit there. Otherwise they get a whole bunch of Chaos Space Marine datasheets, though missing a fair few that you might have expected. In the HQ section there's only the Demon Prince and the Master of Executions, no Chaos Lords apparently. For other squads you get Terminators and Spawn, like the Death Guard and Thousand Suns. We're missing some other more generic options like Bikers, Havocs or Raptors for example. Not great if you're already collecting World Eaters and you had those models. Otherwise, if anything, there's perhaps more heavy support and demon engines than I might have expected. The Hellbrute, Helldrake, Land Raider, the 2 different variants of Predator, the Defiler, Forge Fiend, Mauler Fiend, Rhino, and perhaps most fittingly out of any of the demon engines, the Khorne Lord of Skulls. If this list is accurate, I feel like the omission of things like Chaos Lords is perhaps the weirdest choice. Just very strange not to be able to field a generic on-foot Chaos Lords to lead your warband, particularly as armies like Death Guard and Thousand Suns still get that option. Otherwise, beyond that, there's a few other things that aren't here either. Sub-factions are one in particular. It's a bit of a departure for things like Death Guard and Thousand Suns, who have their plague companies or great cults. I feel like perhaps for World Eaters they're not particularly needed, seeing as they're kind of a sub-faction themselves, and again might be Games Workshop cutting down on rules bloat. Otherwise, it also doesn't seem that there's any single points cost upgrade type ability, something that's been quite common for other armies, like say the Imperial Knights Exalted Court, the Chaos Space Marines Marks of Chaos, or the Chaos Demons Exalted Greater Demons. There's no hints of there being any secondary objectives in the book either, but I guess that's kind of not unexpected, similar to the Imperial Guard. If you need secondary objectives, they're probably going to be in the Grand Tournament packs. The Arcs of Omen one does feature some World Eaters ones. Let's go through the rules bit by bit though, and we'll start with the ones that we're perhaps missing the most of. I feel like there are a few basic questions as to the standard housekeeping rules that a lot of armies get, and these don't seem to have featured prominently in the leaks or anything. Perhaps some of the biggest questions are what will get objectives secured, could quite alter the feel of things like the Jakhals or the World Eaters Khorne Berzerkers. I feel like they're either going to go down the Chaos Space Marines route of making their Jakhals objectives secured, or go down the Death Guard and Thousand Suns route of making the Terminators objectives secured. If anything, I would guess that it will probably be the Chaos Space Marine route and the Jakhals will get it. It does seem that just from all of the leaks that we're getting that this is a very different one from Thousand Suns and Death Guard, and they're not making the Codex along the same pattern as them. Besides that, Games Workshop did confirm that you'll be able to take multiple Lords within the same detachment, so you could have Lord Invocatus and the Lord on the Juggernaut in the same army. I don't believe that they said anything about Demon Princes though, often they're limited to 1 per detachment, though I guess you'd be able to take more in Arcs of Omen for 1 CP. Finally, I'd guess that the Cultist restrictions will be kind of similar to Chaos Space Marines or the other flavours of Chaos. Most likely no more squads of Jakhals than you have core World Eaters choices like Khorne Berzerkers or Terminators. Moving on, we've got the improved World Eaters Legion trait, this one apparently called Relentless Rage according to the Warhammer Plus Battle Report. The previous World Eaters trait was +1 attack on the charge, then it got upgraded to +1 attack when you were charged or heroically intervened, and now as well as the +1 attack you also apparently get +1 strength as well, perhaps feeling like you might be rolling in the Mark of Khorne bonus across most of the army. I feel like just from the units and the various massive army buffs that they've got going for them, World Eaters are probably going to hit the units that they engage in melee very, very hard, and that +1 strength is just another piece in the puzzle, probably most useful on mid-strength things like Khorne Berzerkers, who say increasing from strength 5 to strength 6 or something might be a big deal. Next up, and one of the most exciting things from the Codex I think, is the Blood Tithe. This is the pure army game mechanic that Games Workshop previewed in their battle report again. Again, these rules are basically confirmed by the last two on the Blood Tithe abilities list. The rule's their pure army special rule between World Eaters units and Agents of Chaos and unaligned things. If you have nothing else like say Thousand Suns or Death Guard, then you can get this rule. And as per the Battle Brothers rules, you'll still be able to take allied Khorne demons and not break it. I feel like this rule's really quite fluffy. You basically gain points as things die on the battlefield, and what's most fun is that it applies to our own units equally to the enemies, as famously Khorne cares not from where the blood flows. Every time a unit is destroyed, then you get 1 Blood Tithe point, friend or foe, and on top of that there's a couple of other per phase benefits that you can get max of 1 per phase. If a character, monster or vehicle is killed, friend or foe, then you get an extra Blood Tithe point, and if a Titanic unit was killed during that same phase, then you can get an additional Blood Tithe point above that. Say for example, killing a single enemy knight will net you 3 Blood Tithe points. It does feel like if you want to farm these up quickly, you could take a fair few chaff units, in particular Chaos Spawn look like they'd be excellent for that. A trio of those for 75 points looks pretty awesome. Throw them forward, if they kill something then all well and good, if not and they die then they're going to be unlocking army-wide rules. When you acquire these Blood Tithe points, it looks like you can then spend them at the end of any phase, opponent or yours. That was the way that they were using them in the battle report, say for example manifesting the 5+ save against mortal wounds one before an enemy psychic phase. Once these things are unlocked, besides the Angron one they stay for the entire game, and it feels like World Eaters, perhaps even more so than Drukhari, will get very snowbally towards the end of the game, their units generally being a bit tougher and also vastly more dangerous in melee. Games Workshop confirmed 6 of the rumoured 8 of them in their recent battle report. For 2 Blood Tithe points there's a 5+ save against mortal wounds, very nice insurance against psychers. For 3 there's a +1 to charge, perhaps seemingly innocuous, but if it even gets you an extra successful charge over the course of the game with World Eaters damage, that could be very, very worth it. For 4 there's a 6+ feel no pain, so a bit more general toughness army wide. Again for 4 you can improve your AP in melee by -1 army wide. That one might have been more meaningful before Armour of Contempt changed, but against certain high save armies it still seems good. For 5, there's a very broad all-encompassing buff to melee, 6s to hit gain an extra hit, a pretty massive damage boost, perhaps particularly effective on things like Terminators with Power Fists, and then finally for 6, perhaps the single most intimidating one, if Angron has died during the game, then he gets to be resurrected basically, coming in from reserve again with Warp Strike, so setting up 9 inches away from the enemy, and he gets 8 wounds remaining. There's no cap on doing this more than once as well, so you could have him killed and returned multiple times, provided you could spare the Tithe points. A pretty crazy prospect, considering just how much melee threat he has. Finally, the last 2 rumoured ones that we don't know the amount of points for are a +1 to hit in melee, and 6s to hit in melee auto wounding. I guess the +1 to hit might be 5, the same as the 6s to hit, gaining an extra hit. They seem kind of well balanced in terms of the maths, to be honest, though who knows. And the 6s to hit auto wounding will be quite nice against very tough targets, perhaps armies like Imperial Knights in particular. Overall, it feels like quite a nice mechanic. I really quite like the fluffy way that it unlocks, and in general I feel like the table's pretty well balanced. Most of them are very, very usable. I feel like that 5+ save against mortal wounds in the right matchup is perhaps one of the best value of them, certainly if you're countering Thousand Suns or Grey Knight's trickery. That's going to save you a whole ton of damage. Otherwise they're all pretty solid, and I feel like respawning Angron repeatedly is pretty intimidating psychologically. Moving on, we've got the World Eater Stratagems. All of these are confirmed bar the Smoke Launcher one, though it does seem like quite a stock one. For 1 CP, we've got Scorn of Sorcery, a 4+ to deny psychic power within 24 inches. Quite a standard pattern one throughout Warhammer 40k. Always great if your opponent's got an absolute linchpin psychic power that you can just say nope to. Means taking psychic secondaries are always a bit risky as well. For 1 CP, there's the Icon of Wrath. An icon unit gets to charge 3d6 inches and drop the lowest. I guess that would usually be the Khorne Berzerkers. For 1 CP, we've got Gory Dismemberment. This is where a core or character unit gets 6s to wounds, deal a mortal wounds to a maximum of 6. If you're throwing around the amount of attacks that World Eaters normally do, that's often going to convert a fair amount of them, I think. Seems like that's usually going to be a fairly solid damage boost for 1 CP if you're in combat with something that you don't think that you're going to kill reliably. For 1 or 2 CP, we've got Blood Frenzy. A core unit fights on death this phase. It's 2 CP if it's not troops. This one I feel might be one of the single most valuable ones out of any on offer here. Melee is really common in 40k, and if the enemy charges your troops and is planning on wiping them out before they get to strike, then for 1 or 2 CP you can basically have them taking massive casualties as they do so, potentially even wiping them out if you've got enough damage. Really good that one, and I feel like that one's going to be a staple. For 1 or 2 CP we've got Skulls for the Skull Throne. Kill the enemy warlord with one of your characters to gain 2 blood tithe points, or +1 to advance and charge for that character for the rest of the game, or you get to pick both for 2 CP. A bit niche really, I'm sure the opponent isn't going to be planning on getting their warlord killed unless things are going bad for them anyway. Perhaps seems most relevant on Angron though, who picking up a +1 to advance and charge for the rest of the game would be nice. For 2 CP we've got Red Butchers, unfortunately not a unit anymore, but just a stratagem, a +1 damage for Terminators or 8-bound in melee. A little pricey, but totally worth it against the right foes. Maybe things like upgrading Terminator Power Fist to damage 3 against 3 wound infantry could be particularly good. For 1 CP we've got Aggressive Intervention. A core unit can heroically intervene 6 inches, and this means that the enemy just can't afford to get anywhere near to Khorne Berzerkers or the like, not unless they want to be in combat and hit very hard with chain axes. Seems particularly brutal if it combos with that Berserker rule where they get to move closer when they're shot. You could potentially position perfectly outside of this, cause a casualty on the Khorne Berzerkers, and have them get closer to be able to trigger it. Finally, for 1 CP we've got Smoke Launchers, a -1 to hit against relevant vehicles. Not exactly the most exciting one, and kind of a bit sad if a generic bit of war gear is taking up one of the 8 stratagem slots. Still though, certainly seems usable enough. I feel like rhinos are going to be wanted for the World Eaters Khorne Berzerkers. Overall, it does look like a vastly thinned out stratagem section, but I feel like at least the vast majority of these ones are pretty meaningful and usable, perhaps dispensing with a few of the more niche ones that you might get in other codexes. Next up, let's do Warlord Traits and Relics. These Warlord Traits are just entirely unconfirmed all the way through so far, but according to the leaks, the way that they're going to work is that you only have 3 generic ones. There's no way to buy more than one, as we've already seen the stratagems, there's no extra Warlord Trait stratagem, so it's basically the choice between these 3, or make either Angron, Khorne, or Lord Invocatus your Warlord and have their unique one. For the generic ones, your options are always fighting first in melee, a little bit on the weak side if you ask me, half damage in melee, maybe not terrible on something like a Demon Prince, but doesn't help him against guns, or third option for each unit killed by the Warlord gets another blood tithe point. That last one seems handy enough. World Eater's characters are going to be fairly fighty. Can't say I'm really super enthused about any of those, to be honest. They kind of feel like minor upgrades, and certainly not quite as meaningful as, say, Chaos Space Marine ones, where you get to reroll all wounds and things. Otherwise, for the unique characters, Angron apparently gets a 6-inch aura of no objective secured. Perhaps not terrible, but I feel like with the amount of attacks that he gets, he's often going to be killing the vast majority of models that he gets into contact with anyway, and as he still only counts as one model himself, turning off Auspex just might not be all that meaningful if he's alone on an objective with some enemies. They might still outnumber him in terms of models even if he turns off their objective secured. Overall, I feel like that's just not going to come into effect all that much compared with, say, if it was on a different unit. Perhaps kind of a shame if it's accurate, as if he follows the other Supreme Commander's Warlord type rules, he will have to be the Warlord if he's in your army. Otherwise, for Kyler Betrayer, apparently he's going to get a reincarnation of the rule that if there's 6 or more enemy models within 3 inches of him, he gets plus D3 attacks. Again, a bit on the situational side if you ask me. And finally, Lord Invocatus just blows all the other Warlord traits far out the water. From his leaked datasheet, he gets one where both he and 2 other core units within 9 inches of him get to make a pre-game normal move. If that one remains for the final version, it just seems vastly better than the rest. It means that you could effectively have your Terminators or Berserkers starting a bit closer to the enemy, pretty much always going to be a good thing when you're packing the amount of melee that the World Eaters do. I feel like Invocatus' biggest problem might actually be Angron. He seems very efficient and pretty scary to have on the board, and it means that if he's in the army, I suspect he'd have to be your Warlord. Might be a kind of tough choice to make whether you feel the might and rage that is Angron, though doing so might mean that you miss out on this pretty excellent trait. Overall, out of all of these, if they do turn out to be accurate, I'd rate pretty much all the rest as kind of underwhelming. I guess perhaps Angron's one as situationally useful depending on what he's fighting alongside, though the one for Lord Invocatus just looks absolutely standout. Next up, we've got 3 Relics of Khorne. Again, with the stratagem list that we've seen, no option for having more than one. And Games Workshop has confirmed the Berserker Glaive relic on their battle report, which does fit perfectly with the leaks. The Berserker Glaive is a relic that replaces the Exalted Chainblade on a Juggernaut Lord or an Axe of Dismemberment on the Master of Executions, and it gives you a Strength +2, AP -3, and Damage 2, 6 to hit, causing 2 additional hits. Seems to me that this will be far more useful in the Juggernaut Lord than the Axe of Dismemberment, where it feels more like a side grade. Getting hit rolls of a 6 counting as 2 mortal wounds if it stays the same as the Chaos Space Marine Codex is pretty mad, whereas the Juggernaut Lord apparently is getting an AP -2 damage 2 Exalted Chainblade, so this feels like it's a very solid upgrade on that. Otherwise, from the leaks, we also have a buffing relic which allows you to nominate a core unit within 9 inches. That unit auto wounds enemies on 6s to hit in melee. Really quite a nice buff, though it does overlap with one of the Blood Tithe leaked abilities. That one looks alright to be honest. Really quite nice for a character making war alongside some Terminators or Berserkers. Finally, there's a morale relic where each model slain by this unit counts as 2 for morale purposes. Not useless, but not very reliable. It's not going to be any help against enemy characters, vehicles, or various units that have morale immunity. For me, the choice for the relic would be between the Berserker Glaive and the relic for the auto wounds. Probably the auto wounds has more value, though the Berserker Glaive would take less coordination. As per the leaks, that seems to be it for the core rules of the Codex, so let's talk about datasheets and then move forward to the Army of Renown after that. First up, let's start with the man himself, Angron, who's rumoured to be 360 points and a Lord of War choice as per the leaked points cost page, though most of the other details that we have from this have been confirmed by seeing him in action in Games Workshop's battle report. His stat line that Games Workshop have confirmed is pretty immense: a huge 16-inch move, hits on 2s, strength 9 and toughness 7, 18 wounds, 12 attacks, leadership 10, and a better save than his brothers with a 2+ save and a 4+ invul. If all of this might does indeed come for 360 points, it looks pretty good value, particularly with the respawning thing. His profile degrades on its movement and attacks to a minimum of 8 attacks, and with the World Eater's Legion trait, it still means that he's hitting very hard even on his lowest bracket. In combat, again confirmed by Games Workshop, we have his melee, Samniarius and Spine Grinder, either having a sweep or a slash option. The slash being the big one for taking out hard targets, strength 14, AP -4, and damage D3+3. Pretty huge with his whopping 12 attacks or 13 on the charge. And then the sweep attack doesn't really feel any less apocalyptic, as he'd generally be hitting with a massive 39 attacks at strength 9, AP -3, and damage 1. You don't want to be an infantry unit getting in the way of that. In general, there's quite a lot of units he's just going to remove from the board straight away, and even the tougher things he's going to tear a big chunk out of. Then for his special rules, he gets his Wrathful Presence one, where he's got the choice of 3 different auras at the start of your command phase. You can either give an aura of 6 inches of +1 attack to all core units, an aura of re-rolling hits of 1 in melee for all other World Eaters units besides Angron, and perhaps the most intimidating of all, an aura of no falling back, that one affecting friend and foe. Both of the damage buffs are interesting enough, I suppose, definitely ones to go for if you don't have the option to make gamey locks in combat. The no falling back one truly could be absolutely devastating for shooting armies though. In theory you could charge Angron at something, kill that thing dead with his massive melee profile, and then consolidate into something else, and then know that in your enemy's turn they can't shoot Angron because he's locked in combat, and unless they have a massive countercharge threat on their own that can bring down the Red Angel, he's just going to happily murder another one of their units in their own turn before being ready to strike at yet more things in the World Eater's next turn. That one looks absolutely brutal, and feels like he could be near invulnerable against a shooting army, where he did get amongst the middle of them. Other than that, he also gets his Champion of the Arena rule, where he gets to pick a single core or character unit to reroll all hit rolls, Chapter Master style buffs as before, and he could use that to target himself. As mentioned, his Warlord Trait is rumoured to be a 6-inch aura of cancelling enemy objective secured, and he can also respawn as well with the Blood Tithe for 6 points, repeatedly popping up on the board if the enemy does manage to kill him. Overall, it just generally looks like Angron's going to be a bit of a nightmare for the enemy player. Enormous threat range, reliably killing a unit or tearing a chunk out of them every turn, and then potentially respawning if you do invest all the effort of actually killing him. Moving on, we've got the iconic Khorne Berzerkers, remaining a troop's choice of 5 to 10 models at 22 points per model, and a stat line very similar to their White Dwarf profile, getting 5 attacks at strength 5 with their Berserker glaives, hitting at AP -2. I'm a little uncertain as to whether or not their Icon of Wrath is still going to give them an extra pip of AP, or whether it might do something else in the World Eaters Codex. It did seem in Games Workshop's battle report they were still striking at AP -2, so perhaps not entirely clear there. In any case, the icon does cost 5 points. You can use it to unlock that stratagem for 3d6 drop the lowest charge. Plasma pistols are 5 points each extra. And they'll also have the option of the Berserker Eviscerator for an extra 5 points. It's basically their equivalent of a heavy melee weapon, supposedly getting strength +3, AP -4 and damage 2, but no -1 to hit. Pretty brutal when you're getting 4 or 5 attacks. Perhaps the most interesting thing on top of all this, though, is they gain a new Blood Surge mechanic that allows them to surge over towards the enemy when they're shot. The Blood Surge is really quite an interesting special rule that appears to trigger after Khorne Berzerkers take casualties from shooting, and Games Workshop again confirmed this with their battle report. The rule that they previewed didn't appear to have any sort of prevention on doing it multiple times per turn, so at least in theory, according to this, you might be able to repeatedly Blood Surge across the board if you keep on taking casualties, though I guess it's not impossible they might not have shown the entire rule, and you might be able to only do it once per enemy shooting phase. In any case, if the enemy shoots at your Khorne Berzerkers and kills one or more of them, you get to trigger this rule. You roll a d6 and you get to move that far as close as possible towards the nearest enemy unit. If you happen to wind up in engagement range with them, then you're allowed to enter it with that unit, but you can only enter engagement range with the closest one. You can't use the move to lock up multiple enemies. It means that shooting Khorne Berzerkers before charging them could be a risky ploy if you do manage to get locked up by Khorne Berzerkers basically countercharging you after you fire guns at them. There are a couple of restrictions on this. It cancels any actions that the unit might have been doing as you might have expected, and you also can't use it after you've disembarked from a destroyed transport that same turn. I guess the Berserkers are a bit tangled up in the wreckage, and it might prevent gamey positioning out of the transport. Seems really powerful though, particularly with that stratagem for the 6-inch heroic intervention. If Khorne Berzerkers are anywhere near, then they could be very threatening for where you position your troops. If they potentially move within 6 inches of your units and then use that heroic intervention stratagem, then they might get a surprise melee that they seems nowhere near to be able to make. Overall seems good though. Between this and their impressive melee stats, I feel like Khorne Berzerker units are probably going to be usable, probably being transported in rhinos I suspect. Otherwise, for the new unit in the troops choice, we've got the new Jakhals, 10 to 20 cultist type models with some hyper-violent chain blades. Supposedly they're going to be 7 points per model, though I feel like for these more than most of the other units we do have a few questions. We don't know whether they get objective secured or not yet, and we don't know whether or not they get the World Eater's Legion trait. It'd mean quite a big difference for their combat abilities if they did or didn't. Their stat line kind of feels like a standard Chaos Cultist but a bit fightier, hitting on 4s, strength and toughness 3, 1 wound, 2 attacks, leadership 6 and a 6+ save. And they do get a couple of other unique models within the squad, a Dishonored who's a big muscly one who gets strength 4, and a Jackal leader who gets 3 attacks and leadership 7. Their standard weapons are just melee at strength user and AP -1, representing those 2 chain blades that each one of them wields. And then within the unit there's 2 different options for upgrades, each one plus 5 points each, and you can take 1 per 10. One of them is a strength +2, AP -2 and damage 2 weapon that's -1 to hit. I suspect that that's the big chain blade that one of them can take. And one of them strength user, AP -2 and damage 2 but double attacks. I would guess that that's probably the skull masher that the Dishonored can take. Means that he'd be hitting with 4 attacks at AP -2 and damage 2 if that's right. On top of that, they can apparently take a Jackal icon for 5 points. Not sure what that does yet though. Finally, apparently these guys can also trigger a special rule once per game. Take D3 casualties on your unit, but gets +1 strength for the duration of the combat phase. Certainly a bit of a trade-off there. I guess it's going to be more efficient on bigger units rather than smaller ones. I guess particularly if it makes the difference between wounding something on 4s rather than wounding them on 5s, then that is going to be quite important. Overall though, I feel like this is kind of going to depend on whether or not they get the World Eater's Legion trait or not. If they do, they're going to get their attacks hitting at strength 4 AP -1 most of the time, and that does seem pretty awesome. If they don't, then only 2 attacks at strength 3 AP -1 seems kind of lackluster if you are paying 7 points per model. I feel like if they get the Legion trait, they'll probably be quite good. If they don't, they might be a bit on the underwhelming side. Moving on, we've got our World Eaters but possessed, the 8-bound. These guys are apparently going to be available in squads between 3 and 6 strong and are 40 points per model. Again, very limited previews from Games Workshop so far. I'm sure at some stage they'll preview something, but these are entirely from the leaks rules. In general, their stat line seems kind of similar to the possessed for the Chaos Space Marines, a 9-inch move, hitting on 3s, strength 6, toughness 5, 4 attacks, 3 wounds, leadership 8, and a 3+ save with a 5+ invul, the sergeant getting a +1 attack. Overall, the profile perhaps seems a little bit more brutal in melee compared with the Chaos Space Marine possessed, but they don't really seem any massively tougher and also cost quite a lot more. In melee, supposedly they hit with 8-bound eviscerators, strength user AP -3 and damage 2, and you get +1 attack for each one of those, putting up each standard 8-bound up to a theoretical 7 attacks each on the charge, I guess. That's including the Legion trait. If you can make an 120-point unit hit home, in theory that would be 22 attacks at strength 7, AP -3 and damage 2, which is pretty scary. Seems like you'd absolutely murder things like Space Marines with that, but do pretty hefty damage to anything that isn't toughness 8 or above. So far, I think the only confirmed rules that we do have for these guys is they have a rule called Blood Scent. This allows them to arrive from Strategic Reserve in round 1, so I guess you could be guaranteed a long chance at a charge of them if you could roll that 9 or above. We also know that they can ride in Land Raiders, I suspect taking up 2 slots the same as Possessed 2, and perhaps one of the biggest questions is whether or not they're going to be core like the Terminators or the Khorne Berzerkers will be, or whether they'll follow the Chaos Space Marine route of having Possessed being Demonkin but not core. I feel like it might be a little bit on the sad side if they weren't a core unit. The World Eaters don't seem to have an enormous amount of core buffs going around, and that would mean that they'd only have 2 core units in the book. Otherwise, the Exalted Eightbound from the leaked points sheet would be 45 points each, but locks to a unit size of 3 models, no more, no less. They're rumoured to be having a similar sort of profile to the standard 8-bound, the main differences being that they hit on a 2+ in combat and get a 4+ invul save rather than the 5+, so a bit tougher to kill with higher AP weapons, I suppose. The rules for their weapon profile seem to be a little bit more garbled than some of the other leaks that we got. It seems that the standard loadout for the unit is 1 8-bound eviscerator with the profile that we had before, giving you 1 extra attack, and then 1 8-bound chain fist, which seems to be a flat upgrade. Strength +3, AP -4, and damage 2. So I guess usually at strength 10 once you've considered the World Eater's Legion trait. Apparently these don't get any -1 to hit like other chain fists, but also don't get any extra damage against vehicles. Apparently the Sergeant might be getting a few options, including the option to take 2 chain fists for damage 3 attacks rather than damage 2, and also the option of a big eviscerator with some sort of sweep profile. Though from Games Workshop's battle report, it looks like it didn't make too much difference when they were rolling the attacks for these. Otherwise, they mentioned that they've got some sort of rule called Blood Fury, which between the preview and the leak sounds like they're going to have a rule that prevents fallback. My guess would be something akin to Warp Talons, a 4+ chance to keep the enemy locked in combat unless they're monsters or vehicles or something. Apparently they'll also be able to arrive from Warp Strike. Next up, we've got the World Eaters HQs, and starting off with Khan the Betrayer himself, 140 points in the new book apparently, and this was one of the places that Games Workshop's official previews diverged from the leaks in that it looks like he's got a bit more threatening. From the leaks, his stat line was a 6-inch move, hitting on 2s, strength 6 and toughness 4, 6 wounds, a big 9 attacks, leadership 9 and a 3+ save, with a 4+ invul to keep him safe. From the battle report preview, we got the profile for his melee with 10 attacks at AP -4 and damage 3. That will be including the World Eater's trait, so it would fit with the attacks of 9 from the Leaks profile. The damage 3 though is new, it means that he's just monstrously destructive in close combat, even if he's not the hardest character to kill in the world if you can get him exposed. He has basically traded his fights twice special rule for just more base damage, which maybe isn't the worst thing in the world. At least the enemy won't have the option of interrupting before his second swing. His overcharged plasma pistol remains at strength 8, AP -3 and damage 2. Confirmed from the battle report is that he gets a damage buff with lieutenant style rerolls, a 6-inch aura reroll 1s to wound for core units, and I strongly suspect he's going to also be keeping his betrayer rule, where on a 2+ he has the chance to cause mortal wounds to friendly units within 3 inches. Overall looks better. It looked like the original leaks rules for this guy were looking kind of underwhelming. Sounds like he might have been a unit where they playtested him and found him a little bit lacking, so gave him extra damage on his big axe. Next up, we've got the Lord on the Juggernaut. This guy apparently an 125 point HQ choice with the cavalry keyword, a stat line with movement of 10, hitting on 2s, strength 6 and toughness 5, 7 attacks, 8 wounds, leadership 9 and a 3+ save with a 4+ invul. Overall a fairly decent amount of speed there, though cavalry will be kind of annoying with negotiating around terrain and things. It means that his melee as well would usually be hitting at a strength of 8 between the Exalted Chainblade plus the World Eater's trait and at AP -2 and damage 2. I guess 8 attacks at strength 8 will be a number to please Khorne. In the battle report, Games Workshop confirmed that he will be getting a movement buff of a 6-inch aura of a +2 to move for nearby core units. That's one that Lord Invocatus also gets, and it does seem like it could be a pretty handy movement buff for World Eaters. Often the main challenge is actually getting them into combat rather than exactly how much damage they do when they get there. Not sure whether or not he'll get the standard Lord reroll 1s to hit. I'd kind of expect so, but they are doing a fair few things differently in this book. Finally, for the unique World Eaters units, we've got Lord Invocatus, who seems like he's a very tempting HQ choice to be honest. He's a unique special character with a demonic possession backstory, where he apparently rides on a blood crusher that flies through the sky on a tide of burning fire. He's apparently going to be 160 points from the points leaks, and gets a bit of an upgraded profile on the generic Juggernaut Lord, a slightly better movement at 12 inches, toughness 6 rather than 5 apparently, a 2+ save, and perhaps most importantly the fly keyword, which means that you'd get around any irritation from the cavalry keyword, jumping about the board and hopping over terrain on your burning fire, I suppose. Weapons-wise, from his leaks datasheets, he gets an axe called Coward's Bane. That one's strength user, AP -3 and damage 2, with a pretty useful addition of ignoring invulnerable saves, so it's a pretty excellent character killer. His Juggernaut also gets a bladed horn attack with 3 attacks at strength user, AP -2 and damage 1. That's the same as the regular Juggernaut Lord. He gets the option to Warp Strike, perhaps because he's a demon, gets the aura of +2 inches to either normal move or advances, and also gets his Warlord trait as we mentioned before, included on the datasheet that he gets a pre-game move, and so do 2 other core units within 9 inches. Overall he does look like a very solid HQ, fast moving, hard hitting and ignoring invul saves. The 2-inch movement buff is very nice, and perhaps in particular that Warlord trait looks very good as well. If you don't happen to be including Angron, I feel like he's basically auto-include. Otherwise, from the leaks we have a few bits of information on the other units within the World Eaters Codex, the things that are basically Chaos Space Marine units but ported to World Eaters. First up, with that unit list that we had earlier, it does appear to tally pretty well with Games Workshop promo shots. I don't think that we've seen anything in the images of the army shots they've shown us that don't tally with the things that were rumoured to be in the Codex. For the HQ choices, supposedly the Master of Executions and the Demon Prince are both going to be +1 attack and +1 strength over their standard Chaos Space Marine versions. The Master of Executions jumping from the Elite slot to the HQ slot here according to that leak's points list, and the Demon Prince I guess getting the +1 strength and attack folded in kind of fits with being locked to taking the Mark of Khorne. The Master of Executions on the Elite points was 65 points, and the Demon Prince 130, and a +35 for the wings if you wanted them, all other war gear being free, and getting a profile to match that new Warp Bolter on the new Demon Prince model, heavy 3 at 24 inches, strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2. The Terminators also get a bit of World Eater's Legion trait folded into their rules with +1 strength and +1 attack over their base profile, remaining costing 33 points, the same as the previous Chaos Space Marine ones were. I guess compared with Chaos Space Marine ones, these ones won't be quite as durable, but will be monumentally fighty in close combat. They won't have the same amount of toughness and buffing spells available to them in a codex that doesn't use Psychic. The Land Raider and the Predators both look like they're costed the same amount to equal the Chaos Space Marine version, with the Toughness 9 Land Raider and the Toughness 8 Predator, both of them getting the Soul Shatter las cannons. The Soul Shatter profile was confirmed to be in the Codex from the Games Workshop Battle Report. That's las cannons with d6 plus 2 damage for the Land Raider sponsons and the Predator turret option. Otherwise, there's the Demon Engines with the Lorn of Skulls, Defiler, Forge Fiend, Mauler Fiend, Helldrake, all being the same as the Chaos Space Marine Codex. And the spawn cost 25 points, the same as the Chaos Space Marine ones. They'll probably have that same regeneration type profile and seem very interesting to be a unit that you could just throw away as expendable blood Tithe points. Otherwise, supposedly the Hellbrute gets +1 strength and +1 attack, again representing a mark of Khorne built in, I suppose. And the Rhino will be the same as it was before. Probably going to be a fairly staple unit if Khorne Berzerkers do take off and be a popular choice within the book, which you'd hope. That's it for the units, but apparently beyond the main way to play the army, there's also going to be an army of renown in here, allowing you to play a bit of a Khorne Demonkin style army, called the Disciples of the Red Angel. Again, this isn't something that Games Workshop have confirmed officially in any way at time of recording, but basically the idea sounds to be that you take Angron and you lead just about every Khorne Demon unit that you can find under the sun, a lot of which are within Codex World Eaters, with the new 8-bound, plus a couple of the HQ choices and things. And then supposedly you can freely mix and match in some regular Khorne demons into the same army, and you get a bunch of additional rules on top of that. In terms of units that you're allowed to take, you've got to take Angron, who must be the Warlord, and then beyond that it's World Eaters, Demons, plus Land Raiders. The army does mainly feel like it's meant to circle around Angron plus the new 8-bound models, who are likely first and foremost with all the support options they get. It sounds like the Lord of Skulls and the other Demon Engines would be in, Lord Invocators and the Demon Prince, but no things like Berserkers or Terminators, which will be kind of sad. Then beyond that, you can also field Khorne Demons from Codex Chaos Demons as well, supposedly within the same detachment according to the leaks. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of restriction on them though, say taking fewer Khorne Demon units than you have World Eaters, or having them in their own allied patrol or something with Battle Brothers. I guess being able to mix in demons perhaps a little bit more freely is a bit of an advantage there. But beyond that, you do trade out a few of the standard World Eaters rules for a few more special rules from this. Apparently you don't get an extra whole army benefit, but you do get a buff to a single unit of 8-bound, swapping out the generic stratagems for a new set of 8, and then 3 new relics that you swap out the standard World Eaters version for. First up, apparently one unit of 8-bound get upgraded per army. Between these you either get to choose one standard unit of 8-bound to get all 3 of these buffs, or one exalted unit to get one of them. Again, as per this entire army of renown, Games Workshop haven't lifted the lid on this officially yet. This is 100% going by leaks. In any case, the rumoured 3 buffs are that they count as 2 models for objectives, gets to deal an extra mortal wound on 6s to wound in melee, or get a 4+ save against mortal wounds. I feel like if you're upgrading the Exalted 8-bound, you'd probably want the second one with the extra melee damage, I suppose. But I feel like you'd probably get the most value out of this out of a big squad of standard 8-bound if they are between 3 and 6. You just get one unit that's likely to hit a bunch of mortal wounds into the enemy, plus also having a bit of objective work and mortal wound protection doesn't hurt. Then we've got the 3 additional relics that you get to swap the standard set for. Again, these are from the leaks, and this set are a little bit on the vague side, I must admit. I guess seeing as you can only give relics to the generic characters, not the named ones, I think that this would usually just apply to the Demon Princes, though I guess it's not impossible that the generic Juggernaut Lord might count for this as well. He doesn't exactly feel like a demonic unit in himself, but I suppose he is riding a demon steed. In any case, these 3 relics are apparently a +1 to saving throw and +1 wound, a small but helpful durability boost I guess. The second one's an option to replace the Demon Prince's bolt gun with a 2d6 auto hit profile, though hard to weigh that up when it was a bit unclear as to what that auto hit profile was. I'd guess something fairly meaty, as the Warp Bolter type thing does seem to have fairly hefty stats in the first place. Finally, the third option is the Vera can reroll wounds against one nominated unit. Again, a bit on the vague side, this would make a big difference if that's at the start of the game or each command phase or something. I'd guess from the style of rules in 40k that usually tends to be at the start of the game, otherwise I guess they'd just nominate their intended charge target each turn. Kind of impossible to weigh these ones up with so little information. I guess you'd likely be having one boosted Demon Prince per army of renown though. Finally, we've got the 8 stratagems that replace the standard ones in the Disciples of the Red Angel army. And I must admit it's a bit of an interesting idea to replace the set of stratagems that you have wholesale. Definitely would make the whole army function a bit differently. Going through them quickly, for 1 CP we've got a World Eater's unit gets +1 to wound when the squad's less than half strength. Not terrible I suppose, but if you're applying that to 8-bound I guess, the best that you're going to get out of that is 2 8-bounds. I guess doesn't hurt if you've got a depleted unit that you just need to hit something really hard. For 1 CP, an 8-bound unit can consolidate 6 inches when the enemy falls back. Potentially very scary that one. Probably one that I'd try and talk through with the opponent as a bit of a gotcha moment pre-game. Definitely would be a nasty one to spring on your opponent if they just fall back a small difference and suddenly they're in melee again. For 1 CP it would look like 8-bound gets to make that blood surge movement that the Khorne Berzerkers get, an extra d6 inch movement towards the closest target. That one's really quite a threatening stratagem, as just the option to be able to do this could really mean that your opponent has to position differently. Like the Khorne Berzerkers, they couldn't afford to be just next to your 8-bound unit and then shoot it with something, otherwise they're suddenly going to wind up in melee. There's a 1 command point 1 for a vehicle to fight on full profile, I guess one of the demon ones, and I suppose you could apply that to the Lord of Skulls for 2 CP. A 1 command point 1 for an enemy unit not to be able to overwatch, set to defend, and get -1 to hit. Seems pretty good if you just want to get a unit in safely against a big enemy threat, I suppose. A 1 command point 1 for an auto advance of 6 inches for a World Eater's unit, though it does look like we don't have any obvious way to make them advance and charge, making that a little bit less good. Still could be handy enough if you just need that extra movement to guarantee that you get on an objective though. A 1 command point choice to allow you to ignore charge modifiers, maybe a bit on the meaningless side a lot of the time, but quite good against certain stratagems or if you're charging into difficult terrain with a long charge. And finally a morale one where you get to kill an enemy unit in combat, allowing you to use a debuff for a -2 leadership and -1 combat attrition for the morale phase. A bit situational, as with a lot of morale mechanics. Overall, they definitely give you a different style of play to the standard World Eaters ones. I must admit I'm not sure if these are directly stronger than the standard World Eaters army ones though, not if they just replace them wholesale. Losing options like a 6-inch heroic intervention and easy mortal wounds on 6s or +1 damage all do seem a little bit on the sad side, and particularly that one for getting to fight in death. Still though, seems interesting enough. With some slightly less restrictive Khorne Demon allies, I feel like this could be a fun army to run. I think my instincts are, though, that it's probably not worth passing up on the Khorne Berzerkers and Terminators for these stratagems. I'd guess that standard issue World Eaters are going to be stronger than this army of renown, at least by these leaked rules. And there we have it, that's just about every leaked rule and preview that we've seen so far for the World Eaters Codex. Overall looking like a very good time to be a very angry lad with red power armour and a chain axe. Overall, for standout units, I feel like Angron and Lord Invocatus are both looking pretty awesome out of the characters. Khorne Berzerkers potentially seem very disruptive with that blood surge mechanic. Terminators and 8-bound both seem good, and I feel like the standard World Eaters stratagems look like a really strong point of the Codex, with things like heroic interventions, fighting on death, mortal wounds, and extra damage. Blood Tithe seems good. I feel like you could certainly game that a little bit by fielding a few cheap units. Maybe having Berserkers and Rhinos could be one way to increase the tally, as could a few random Chaos Spawn just thrown at the enemy. Overall, definitely feel like it's got a whole ton of power, though I must admit monodimensional armies in Warhammer 40k often tend to be just excessively strong or a bit on the weak side. I feel like the World Eaters don't have a whole ton of viable strategies other than just run up and hit you very hard in close combat. In any case, it will be interesting to see what the rest of the previews and the full Codex has to offer when we get it. In the meantime, I'll certainly be interested to hear what you think of the Codex as we have it so far. How's it going to be facing up to the current big nasties of 40k? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones most days, and I'll look forward to covering the World Eaters Codex in full once we get it. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and that's how I can afford to make quite so many videos like this quite so often. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.